Welcome to my three-part lecture about lifelong science learning. In this first talk, I'm going to discuss the concept of lifelong learning. To talk about the concept of lifelong learning, I'd like to review many of the places where we learn throughout our lives. For example, the classroom. A lot of learning happens in the classroom. You can think about primary school, secondary school, university. And when it comes to learning science, a lot of science learning happens in the laboratory, which I guess is a special type of classroom. Of course, sometimes with classes, there are field trips to places like museums or zoos or aquariums, other places of less formal science learning, a bit of informal science learning, if you will. And then a lot of science learning happens in the media. This is something that happens through all stages of life. Similarly, a lot of people engage with science when they have interest in science-related hobbies. Now, the first three places of science learning are things that are often encountered as a part of formal education. Certainly, the classroom and the laboratory are formal places of learning. And museums are often accompanying that formal learning. But museums are also a type of informal science learning, along with media and hobbies. And they are informal because, well, they don't occur as part of a structured curriculum, necessarily. Now, another characteristic of formal education versus informal education and differences among these types of learning has to do with choice and motivation. You can think about this in terms of what drives people to learn from these different places. So in the classroom, a lot of students are learning because they have to. They learn science in that instance because they are required to study. The motivation is largely extrinsic. And even when they are engaged in learning, sometimes it is in the pursuit of a good grade or to please their parents. So the motivations are quite extrinsic. And moving down through the different venues for education, we end up at hobbies. Hobbies are obviously things that people choose of their own free will and are things that they engage in out of more intrinsic motivation. They engage in them for fun. Now, because they choose hobbies of their own free will, science-related hobbies can be thought of as a type of free choice science learning, as can other types of informal science learning. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So when people learn of their own free choice, it is given that label. And this is often the case when people learn about science in museums and in the media and by engaging in science-related hobbies. And there are some characteristics of free choice science learning. For starters, it's self-directed. People develop their own curricula, essentially. They aren't following the curriculum that someone else has developed. They pick and choose what they want to learn. They're also autonomous because they are choosing their own learning path. A lot of the times, science learning, when it's free choice, is application-oriented. People will have specific tasks they would like to achieve, and they engage in science learning to achieve that task. This is definitely the case with hobbies. Another characteristic of free choice learning is it is driven by interest. This links back with the idea that it reflects intrinsic motivation. And then finally, free choice learning is often collaborative. It's something people do with their family or friends, or sometimes they join clubs of hobbyists, and it can be a highly social activity. Now, why is free choice learning relevant? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One, I would like to draw your attention to the performance of Americans in science and math. And I think it's a fairly well-known fact that Americans, for being from such a developed country, don't perform that well in science and math. And it's often shocking how poorly they perform. But as it turns out, that's really only something that happens among older children. In fact, younger children in the US perform about average compared to children in other developed countries, and adults in the US actually outperform. They are above average in terms of science literacy. Now, how can that be? How is it that adults are somehow learning more about science? How are they continuing to learn and advancing their understanding of science? Well, free choice learning is a good answer. Here's a graph that exemplifies this point. Americans spend a lot of time at places like public libraries, zoos, aquariums, natural history museums, and science and technology museums. These are places outside the classroom that they engage in science learning. And so it's not surprising, given the number of visits, given the frequency at which American adults visit these informal science learning venues, it's not surprising that American adults are actually quite scientifically literate. Another way that adults maintain and develop science literacy is through hobbies. And there was a study looking at science hobbyists in the United States, individuals with interests in scientific, technological, engineering, and mathematical related hobbies. And these researchers were interested in answering a couple questions. First, how did the hobbyist interest develop? And then how has that interest developed over time? And to answer these questions, they conducted a survey of over 2,800 hobbyists in the United States who had interests in a number of different areas. Their hobbies reflected a wide range of scientific interests. And one of the first questions they asked was, when did you develop your interest in your hobby? And many of these hobbies were developed while the hobbyists were in their youth. These are interests that they developed while they were in primary school and while they were first being introduced to a lot of scientific concepts. The researchers also found that there were a number of different sources where these hobbyists developed their interests. So, for example, from family and friends, and this just shows the more social aspects of informal science learning. Very often individuals would develop their interest when there were significant events in their life. So with astronomy, for example, perhaps there was a newsworthy astronomical event that piqued their initial interest. And then, of course, experiences in youth of visiting museums can also pique interest. But then university studies was also a common point of interest. And so education is actually quite important for fostering interest in science hobbies and science issues. What's not on this list, though, is primary school and secondary school and the teachers in those schools. Are they a source of interest for delving into these hobbies? Well, they were included in part of the survey, and they were noted on occasion as sources of interest in these hobbies, but they weren't among the more significant sources of interest. So does that mean that schooling isn't important? Does that mean that these formal places of learning are less important in the development of interest in science, and interest in science that can be lifelong and experienced through hobbies and interests in science news stories and visiting museums? Well, I think science education at an early age is important. It creates some initial sparks of interest, and there are many ways it can foster lifelong learning. Formal education can foster lifelong learning for these reasons. First, it can build confidence to approach scientific questions and to engage with science and learn science. That's a confidence and a competence that can be built through formal schooling. Formal schooling can stimulate interest in science by introducing young minds to interesting scientific concepts. Schooling can provide role models, specifically science teachers are role models of adults who have succeeded in areas of science. Lifelong learning can also be fostered in school by highlighting sources of informal learning, by visiting museums, but also by introducing science media and science news into the curriculum. It can foster lifelong learning by stressing how science works, really cultivating an understanding of how science happens. And this can certainly lead to an interest in hobbies that involve doing science. It can foster lifelong learning by providing a broad science curriculum, introducing young students to a plethora of different scientific concepts and different fields that they may develop an interest in. It can promote independent learning by giving students the tools to ask their own questions and find their own answers. And then finally, school can foster lifelong learning by offering a range of experiences, not just in the classroom and not just in the laboratory, but also by going to museums and meeting scientists. And there are so many ways that school can foster these interests in lifelong learning. And that's something I'll be talking about a little bit more in part 2 of this lecture, where I explore the use of science news in the classroom. If you're curious about any of the work I cited in this lecture, the links are in the description. Thanks for watching.